The United States has just taken a drastic and controversial step, seizing the Venezuelan leader, Nicolás Maduro, in what many are calling an unprecedented move. The implications of this action ripple far beyond Venezuela's borders, creating a storm of debate at the United Nations Security Council. Allies and adversaries alike have condemned the move, but the debate is not as clear-cut as one might expect. Is this a legitimate act of law enforcement against a dictator? Or is it an unlawful breach of international sovereignty that risks creating a dangerous precedent for global relations? In this video, we're diving deep into this controversy, why it happened, how it challenges international norms, and what it means for the future of Venezuela and the world order. But first, let's understand the core of the issue, starting with the current state of Venezuela and the questions surrounding its leader's legitimacy. To understand the gravity of the US's action, we need to rewind and look at the broader picture of Venezuela's political crisis. Nicolás Maduro's regime has long been criticized for its authoritarian grip on power, with accusations of corruption, human rights violations, and a disregard for democratic principles. Yet, despite the international outcry, Maduro has managed to hold on to his position, with support from key allies like Russia and China. But the US, under the Trump administration, has taken a more aggressive stance. Venezuela, once one of the wealthiest nations in Latin America, now faces a dire economic collapse, with hyperinflation, mass poverty, and a humanitarian crisis. Maduro's government has been accused of drug trafficking and harboring terrorist allegations that the US claims justify its military intervention. Still, the legitimacy of the US's actions is highly contested. While many nations agree that Maduro's rule has been oppressive, they argue that military intervention by one country in another's sovereignty sets a dangerous precedent. The UN Charter clearly prohibits the use of force except in cases of self-defense or Security Council authorization. This tension brings us to the crux of the matter. What happens when international law and national interests collide? Can the US justify its actions, or is this a blatant breach of the global order? The US's military action has ignited a firestorm of criticism, not just from adversaries, but from its own allies. At the United Nations Security Council, several countries voiced their concern over what they see as an unlawful use of force. France, for instance, was one of the most vocal critics among US allies. The French Deputy Ambassador, J. Darmodakari, condemned the action, stating that it went against the fundamental principles of peaceful conflict resolution and non-use of force. He argued that such violations chip away at the foundation of the international order and undermine global peace and security. Similarly, Denmark's Deputy Ambassador expressed deep concern over the unfolding situation, warning that it set a dangerous precedent for future international relations. These statements from European countries mark a stark shift in the previously more cautious stance many EU members had taken on the issue of Venezuela. Meanwhile, the UK and Greece have refrained from outright condemnation, choosing instead to call for dialogue and diplomacy in resolving the crisis. This cautious approach, however, has raised eyebrows, especially considering Europe's long-standing commitment to respecting international law and territorial integrity. In contrast, Russia and China have taken a hardline position, accusing the US of neocolonialism and a blatant disregard for international law. Russia's ambassador Vasily Nebenzia even went as far as to call the US's actions international banditry. This divide at the UN highlights the global rift over the use of military force and the future of international diplomacy. How will the world respond when a powerful nation like the US unilaterally decides to intervene in a sovereign nation's affairs? As the situation in Venezuela intensifies, we're witnessing what could be described as a mini crisis within a larger geopolitical crisis. The US, having seized Maduro, now faces the complex challenge of managing the aftermath. The question arises, what comes next? The US insists that its actions are part of a broader effort to fight drug trafficking and terrorism. According to US Ambassador Mike Waltz, the US cannot afford to let Venezuela become a base for adversaries like Iran, Hezbollah, and Cuban intelligence agents. But here's where the issue gets murky. The US's plan to work with Venezuela's existing government apparatus, rather than the opposition or holding fresh elections, raises serious concerns about the legitimacy of the transition. Panama's Ambassador Eloy Alfaro de Alba emphasized that any attempt to maintain the regime with figures like Delcy Rodriguez, one of Maduro's most trusted allies, would amount to little more than a continuation of the repressive system. It would not signal a genuine democratic shift. Meanwhile, Colombia's ambassador, Leonor Zalabada Torres, expressed her firm belief that the US's unilateral use of force constitutes a grave violation of international law and the UN Charter. It's clear that the US's approach has not only led to widespread condemnation, but has also opened the door to further instability in the region. This unfolding situation has the potential to send shockwaves throughout Latin America and beyond. If the US succeeds in its goal, it could alter the region's political landscape in ways we can hardly predict. But if it fails or faces significant pushback, the crisis could escalate even further, pushing Venezuela and the surrounding countries into a new era of uncertainty. At the heart of the crisis lies a complex web of mechanisms that keep Maduro's regime afloat. Despite widespread condemnation, Maduro's government has managed to maintain control over key state institutions and armed forces, with the backing of powerful international allies like Russia, China, and Iran. These relationships complicate any efforts for a quick resolution, especially considering Venezuela's vast oil reserves and strategic geopolitical location. What many fail to recognize, however, is the hidden mechanism of economic control Maduro's government exerts. The regime uses a combination of coercion, patronage networks, and state-controlled businesses to sustain its hold on power. In the meantime, ordinary Venezuelans suffer under the weight of hyperinflation, food scarcity, and a crumbling healthcare system. Yet, the government remains entrenched, with political opponents silenced or driven into exile. The US has targeted these hidden mechanisms in its attempt to weaken Maduro's regime. The seizure of Maduro, as well as targeted sanctions on government officials, is part of a larger strategy to dismantle the political and economic structures that prop up the regime. But this approach also raises questions about the long-term consequences of such interventions. Will these measures destabilize Venezuela even further, or will they pave the way for a more democratic future? By focusing on the hidden mechanisms that sustain Maduro's grip on power, we get a clearer understanding of the challenges that lie ahead. It's not just about removing one man from power, it's about dismantling a system that has been years in the making. The situation in Venezuela has now reached its second crisis point. As the US continues its efforts to destabilize Maduro's regime, the high tension surrounding the country has reached a boiling point. The global response to the US's intervention has been mixed, but one thing is clear. This is no longer just a political battle within Venezuela's borders. The international community is increasingly divided, with nations lining up either to support the US's actions or to condemn them as violations of sovereignty. The second wave of crisis strikes as the consequences of the US military action start to unfold. The initial wave of support for regime change is tempered by the growing realization that any intervention, even with noble intentions, comes with significant risks. Venezuela is now at the center of a global struggle for influence, and as countries like Russia, China, and Iran rally around Maduro, the United States faces a battle not just for Venezuela's future, but for its own credibility on the world stage. With this escalation comes the question: will the US intervention lead to a resolution, or will it escalate into something far worse? There is a fine line between intervention to restore democracy and intervention to enforce power through military means. The world watches as this crisis unfolds, and it's unclear what the lasting consequences will be. The second crisis marks a turning point. The world now faces the potential for a broader regional conflict as other countries, including the EU and Latin American neighbors, wrestle with how to respond to the US's bold and controversial actions. At the heart of this crisis lies the suffering of the Venezuelan people. For years, they've been caught in the crossfire of political and economic turmoil. But now, the stakes are higher than ever. As the US seizes Maduro, it's easy to forget that behind the headlines and geopolitical maneuvering, there are millions of Venezuelans whose lives are being torn apart. The impact of this intervention is felt most acutely by the people on the ground. Economic instability has already left many without access to basic necessities, from food to healthcare. In the midst of the ongoing political conflict, Venezuela's citizens are enduring immense hardships. The US's actions, while aimed at removing a repressive leader, threaten to escalate the crisis rather than resolve it. For the ordinary Venezuelan, this intervention could mean further instability as it pushes the country toward greater violence, uncertainty, and division. Many fear that the US's military action will exacerbate the already fragile humanitarian situation, plunging the country into deeper chaos. In moments like this, it's crucial to remember that the people who will bear the brunt of this crisis are not just pawns in a geopolitical game, they are individuals whose futures are at stake. For every action taken on the international stage, there are real consequences for the lives of everyday people. And this is where the true test lies. Will the international community find a way to bring about a peaceful, democratic transition that serves the will of the Venezuelan people? Or will they continue to fuel a conflict that has already cost countless lives? The consequences of the US's actions in Venezuela are not limited to the borders of this embattled nation. As the intervention unfolds, the ripples are being felt across the globe. From Latin America to Europe, the geopolitical implications are far-reaching. The US's unilateral military action has put a spotlight on the tension between national sovereignty and international law. Many countries, especially in Europe, are now questioning the long-term consequences of such interventions. How can the international community justify such a blatant breach of sovereignty when similar actions, such as Russia's invasion of Ukraine, are met with widespread condemnation? The geopolitical fallout is also being felt in Latin America. Countries like Colombia and Panama have voiced strong opposition to the US's approach, fearing it could trigger a new wave of instability in the region. Venezuela's neighbors are already grappling with the economic and social impact of the crisis, and the US's military action risks exacerbating the situation further. Then there's the matter of global power dynamics. Russia, China, and Iran, all allies of Maduro, have strongly condemned the US's actions, framing the intervention as an act of imperialism. These nations see Venezuela not just as a point of political contention, but as a strategic battleground for influence in the region. As tensions escalate, the world finds itself on the brink of a new Cold War-style standoff, with Venezuela at its epicenter. In a world already marked by instability and division, the US's intervention could mark the beginning of a new era of confrontation and chaos. The question remains, can the world find a way to avoid further escalation, or will this geopolitical struggle only continue to spiral out of control? As we look ahead, the future of Venezuela is uncertain. What lies ahead depends on a range of factors, from international responses to internal pressures. While it's impossible to predict with certainty, we can outline 3 potential scenarios. Scenario 1, the best-case scenario, a peaceful transition. In the best-case scenario, the international community rallies together to support a peaceful, democratic transition in Venezuela. The US, alongside its allies, works with the opposition to hold free and fair elections. Maduro steps down, and a new government, genuinely reflective of the Venezuelan people's will, is established. The economic and humanitarian crises are addressed through coordinated international aid, and Venezuela begins the slow process of recovery. In this scenario, Venezuela becomes a symbol of successful international diplomacy, where the power of peaceful negotiation and legal frameworks triumphs over military intervention. The global community would have a powerful example of how international law and the principles of democracy can help restore peace in a troubled nation. Scenario 2, the middle ground, stalemate and prolonged instability. A more likely outcome may be a prolonged stalemate, with Venezuela continuing to grapple with internal political instability. Maduro might maintain control, but the pressure from the US and international sanctions continues to weaken his grip. The opposition, fractured and divided, struggles to gain significant ground, and Venezuela remains in a perpetual state of turmoil. In this scenario, the humanitarian crisis worsens, with millions of Venezuelans fleeing the country in search of safety. Latin America faces a wave of refugees, and global powers, like the US and Russia, continue to jockey for influence. Venezuela may not return to stability for many years, and the international community is left trying to contain the fallout. Scenario 3, the worst-case scenario, escalation into regional conflict. The worst-case scenario would see Venezuela's crisis escalate into a full-blown regional conflict. The US's intervention could prompt a military response from Maduro's allies, particularly Russia and China. Neighboring countries, already struggling with the fallout, could become embroiled in the conflict, turning Venezuela into a battleground for global powers. The repercussions of this scenario would be catastrophic, not just for Venezuela, but for the entire region. The UN, already divided on how to respond, could face a challenge in maintaining any semblance of international order. As the conflict deepens, the global economy would likely suffer, and international diplomacy could be shattered beyond repair. As we conclude this analysis, the situation in Venezuela remains fraught with complexity. The US's military intervention has sparked intense debate, with global powers divided over the legitimacy of the action. The humanitarian crisis, the global ripple effect, and the future of Venezuela all hang in the balance. The key takeaway here is that the world must adhere to international law and respect the sovereignty of nations, even when facing regimes that are widely seen as illegitimate. The actions taken today will set a precedent for future interventions, and we must be cautious about the dangerous implications that could arise from unchecked military action. The future of Venezuela is still uncertain, but one thing is clear. The Venezuelan people deserve a peaceful, democratic resolution to this crisis. The international community must work together to support a transition that reflects their will, not through force, but through diplomacy, dialogue, and respect for the rule of law. This crisis is far from over, and the stakes are high. The world must not only watch closely, but act thoughtfully to ensure that the path forward leads to a future where peace, democracy, and justice prevail. The question remains, will the international community rise to the challenge, or will it allow this dangerous precedent to spiral out of control?